Copenhagen Lane. Just started recording there. Copenhagen Lane, and for those that are not familiar with that term, the definition of that is providing a protected facility for cyclists, usually by this wide separator infrastructure, typically curbs, and a parking lane adjacent to that. So typically most roads would have the footpath, a curb, parking lane, and then the bicycle lane right next to the parking lane with, in the dooring zone. The protected bicycle lanes, or the Copenhagen lanes, they flip that. So they bring the bicycle lane next to the footpath and the curb, put in another curb, and then put the parking lane adjacent to that. So that's the whole philosophy behind it. And I'm sure people would have seen this kind of design before, but perhaps you haven't actually experienced it as a cyclist. And this type of facility is above and beyond any other on-road cycling facility that you could provide, because you're separated from general traffic. So the live traffic lanes that are, driving past, you don't really need to worry about them. You're also separated from the parked vehicles, and you don't have to worry about the opening door colliding with you. So this is, as I mentioned, this is a really top tier treatment. And if you're looking at providing best practice cycling corridors, off-road shared paths, fantastic. And this is just as good as providing both the level of safety and the level of confidence for cyclists to actually ride there. And as I mentioned in the previous module, if you're targeting cyclists between ages 8 and 80, this is the kind of infrastructure you would be looking at implementing. So for protected bicycle lanes, let's just have a look. This is a quick little survey just to, I suppose, illustrate exactly why we're building this type of infrastructure. 83% of people feel confident to ride in a facility where they are physically protected from general traffic. That drops all the way down to 22%. So roughly 1 in 5 feel confident to ride in more traditional bicycle lanes, which is right next to the parked lane and right next to live traffic lanes. So you can imagine, if we strategically want to get people on the saddle and we want to encourage active transport options, we should be targeting what the majority of people feel confident in riding, which is this protected bicycle lanes. So there's both the level of safety and reducing the risk of a vehicle and cyclist collision. That's one of the major benefits. But it's also the idea of safety and cyclists actually being comfortable in riding that facility as well, which will then ultimately increase in the uptake of cycling. So if you are looking at improving both the connections within local networks and trying to increase the population of cycling within an area, protected bicycle lanes are really the way to be doing this.
A couple of questions in there, Max.
Let's go for it, Ken.
One on any data on possible incidents, crashes with people leaving their vehicle and colliding with cyclists?
Yes, and it is. I've got a little diagram that touches on that a little bit later on, but it is certainly something to consider, where a parked vehicle, so this blue vehicle that I'm drawing on now, whether they hop out and across the bicycle lane and then don't really notice that this is a cycling facility and there's a collision there. I'm not aware of any stats per se that would demonstrate exactly that level of risk. However, I would agree that there is some level of risk of that occurring. Yep.
And the other one was about the gaps in the islands in that example. I assume that's sort of representing some drainage.
Yes, spot on. That's correct. If you are providing these separated facilities, and if you were to install a solid continuous, curb there, which could be done, but you would have to look at replacing all your pits and new drainage lines and the like, because there's nowhere now for this water to escape. It will just pool here into this new curb. So that's why these gaps are typically provided. I've got a few photos later on which perhaps better demonstrate that. But yes, just for drainage there.
Thanks, Max.
Any others?
No, that's it.
Let's get stuck into it. So there's a couple different ways to be installing these protected bicycle lanes. One is the one-way paths, which is the single direction, both sides of the road. So you're using either side of the carriageway. This is just a general cross section here that kind of demonstrates what this looks like. So one cyclist traveling on this side, one cyclist traveling on this side. I'll get into the pros and cons of this approach later on. Here's what it looks like in practice. Here's an example of where you see these islands here, and you can see that there's clearly gaps in here, and this enables drainage to get through, or runoff water to get through and collect in the existing curb and channel rather than pooling at these locations in the parked lane. So that's tends to be the reason why there's gaps in these islands. The other type of facility that you can use is bidirectional paths. So in other words, bringing the cyclists all onto one side of the carriageway and enabling cyclists to travel in both directions on that one facility. These are probably not quite as common. The one-way paths are much more used or applied throughout Australia and New Zealand. However, there are examples of the bidirectional paths, and they do have their particular function. The reason we would be looking at providing a bidirectional path in particular is if your general pedestrian and cyclist generators, so if everything that's exciting is on one side of the road, and maybe this side of the road is an esplanade or maybe a wetland or something that's not going to, not be as quite attractive for cyclists and pedestrian traffic, then if you've got everything that's bringing the cyclists over onto one side of the road, that's where you may have a bidirectional facility. As you can imagine, there's not a lot of instances where cyclists wouldn't want to cross over to the other side of the road, but there are opportunities out there. So an example I can think of is in Bendigo, where they've got a bidirectional facility, Bendigo in rural Victoria, and they have the university on one side of the road, they've got a train rail connection on one side of the road, they've got a high school on one side of the road, and on the other side of the road is just general residential. So they opted for a bidirectional path, which is all on one side of the road to cater for all those significant pedestrian and cyclist generators. And we do provide that as an example later on in the 360-degree video. So you'll get to see exactly why the bidirectional path may have been provided in that instance and not a one-way path either side. Here's an example of what the bidirectional path looks like in the real world. And you may notice that the separator island here is reduced. In the other examples, we saw a much wider island. In this particular example, this is a live traffic lane, so it's not a parked lane. In other words, we don't really need to be considering or worrying about a passenger side door opening up. And that's why this reduced width has been installed. If this were a parking lane and you were concerned about this vehicle with its passenger door opening and swinging open into that facility, that's where you'd be looking at installing a greater width to ensure that you are not creating a conflict point between the door and the cycling facility. Okay, so just a few pros and cons with both of these options. So both of them provide physical separation between traffic and cyclists, so they both get the tick there. The single lane one-way option, that provides physical separation between cyclists travelling in two opposite directions because they're on other sides of the carriageway. A cyclist hitting an opposing cyclist is basically not going to happen. Whereas where you've got the bidirectional facility, you've got them directly adjacent each other. In other words, that head-on crash could occur. Depending on the width of the facility, you may think that's a pretty negligible risk. However, if it is a narrow facility and you do have high cycling volumes, that could be something worth considering and maybe why you opt for a single lane, one way either side. Both of them reduce the risk of dooring compared to an on-road facility. The single lane one way doesn't quite maximize your existing carriageway width. So if you were looking between property boundary to property boundary and looking at that entire carriageway, Where you've got a single lane bicycle facility, the way that you build the protected lanes is single lane, then the physical separator islands, and then traffic lane, separator, and then bicycle lane. So you can see you've got two separators. And if they are to account for the swinging open of the door, they could be 1 to 1.5 meters wide, which means if you were to compare that with the bi-directional facility, and you'd only have to provide the one separator, the one safety island there, then you've maximized that use of the carriageway a little bit better because you're not having to basically build the two islands instead of just the one. So it's just a minor little detail there, but something also worth considering if you were tossing up whether to do one or the other. Cycling facilities are present on both sides of the carriageway, enabling cyclists to get on both sides of the road. That's obviously only relevant to the single lane where you're able to access both sides of the road. Vehicles entering and exiting driveway or local streets have a reduced number of conflict points for cyclists. I'll touch on a couple of diagrams after this slide just to demonstrate these points. Vehicles turning right to enter driveways or side streets would typically have good sight lines. It's not the case for bi-directional facilities. Pedestrians crossing the protected bicycle lane will intuitively know which way the cyclists are coming from. That's not the case with bi-directional facilities because you've got to look out as a pedestrian crossing the bi-directional facility. You've got to look out both ways, which is not typically the way we're brought up to cross these types of environments. And phasing can also be a little bit more complex if you've got signalised intersections with bi-directional facilities. Let me just jump into some actual diagrams to explain what I was just talking about there with bi-directional. So you can imagine this vehicle coming out here. Sorry, Ken, did you want to jump in with some questions?
There's lots going on back here, Matt.
I thought that might be the case.
Yeah. No, and I think people are keen to see the examples which you're about to show, and it may cover a bit of this. I'll quickly, there's been a bit of chat about the meter matters rule and trying to, there's no definition in that. It appears that, whether or not you've got curving or separator or the like, that the rules still apply. So it might be a design consideration. That's a bit of a challenge, and Wade's provided some good examples. In fact, I might just steal the screen here, Max. Sorry, because I've got two of the things that we're talking about ready to go here. Hopefully you can see that now. So Wade's provided a good example there where, it's got the small curve, but you want not really meeting your meter matters requirements there. I mean, it's a much safer facility, but that's an interesting one to play out of the design. I shared this photo of the other view because there was some discussion about how cars would view that crossing. Would they be aware it's priority? So I think that sort of explained that. It's pretty clear, pretty well complied with. The other one is just talking about the width of shared paths and the handlebars and all of that. Should we be doing wider than the 1.8 that you spoke of?
Yeah, there are guidance to kind of illustrate exactly the widths that you'd be providing. But once again, if you are able to maximise that width, I would suggest going for maximum figures rather than aiming for that acceptable minimum. Just as discussed with the shared paths there.
And the last one on that was around, instead of physical islands, the use of line marking so that there's sort of space for cyclists to go into that. What would you be your thoughts on that, Max?
So, sorry, line marking instead of a physical?
Yeah.
So I would certainly recommend a physical kind of curb or something it just, provides that level of definition of the edge of the traffic lane. And if a errant motorist were to, veer out of their traffic lane, they would have to collide with a physical raised surface, which would slow them down, and hopefully, they would feel that and then jump back into their lane. Whereas if you just got line marking there, it might be too late before they realise that they're out of their lane. Yeah.
No, I'm with you on that. For the physical wherever possible, and even people popping in there that just prefer a smaller physical island, but still a physical island there. So good. Okay, let's keep ticking along.
Awesome. So in this example here, this was adopted from an international paper, which is provided down there, NACDO, so USA. And it's just been flipped around so we can see everything on the left-hand side rather than the right-hand side, but it's still a little bit confusing. But I'll just run through what's exactly happening. So this vehicle exiting the driveway and obviously trying to join the carriageway here. You can see for them, intuitively, they want to focus on oncoming traffic. And so their line of vision is kind of out here. So they would most likely be paying attention to cyclists traveling in this direction. However, cyclists in this direction, it's not really within our psyche to be paying attention to that other direction because you're more focused on the oncoming vehicles and obviously picking a gap there rather than looking at the other way and focusing on the cyclists. So that's one little risk with these bi-directional facilities. The other one that I mentioned was regarding, and it's a very similar thing, but pedestrians that were, if they were to cross the road here, it's probably not a road that would be likely to cross, but if they were to be crossing here, once again, they'd be likely to be looking in the direction that you'd expect to see cyclists, and as the direction of travel is in this way, it's all one way here. A pedestrian here crossing would be looking this way for a cyclist and may not notice the cyclist traveling in the opposite direction, and that can raise, it's just, there is a level of risk there associated with these bi-directional facilities, and there is ways to mitigate these risks. You can look at pavement markings or additional signage, or just ensuring that the bicycle lane is incredibly obvious that it's traveling in both directions. If you can make that as clear as possible for all users within the area, that will mitigate the risk to some degree. The other one that I was discussing was a right turning vehicle and why this is challenging to be able to sight oncoming cyclists. So this one was actually adopted from Transport for London. And I've just doctored it a little bit to make it clearer for this particular example, but this right turning vehicle, and I've got the little blinker there so you can see him, he's turning right and crossing the bi-directional facility. He would once again be focused on oncoming traffic and trying to pick a gap with them. It may also be, or secondary focus will be looking at cyclists within this direction, traveling against him. Once again, that's directly in front of his line of vision. So you can imagine that that's within their line of sight and makes sense for them to be looking that way. The cyclists in the other direction, which I have circled in the yellow there, you could imagine if you were driving that vehicle, it's very difficult to be able to turn your head all the way to the right and look behind you essentially to notice oncoming cyclists. So they're traveling in the same direction as you. They could be going 25, 30 kilometers per hour. So you may have to really be looking for cyclists way, way, way back here. But by the time you've completed your right turn maneuver, that cyclist all the way back there might be here now, right at your conflict point. So that's another level of risk with these bi-directional facilities. So generally you want to make sure that there's not too many driveways, there's not too many right turning movements within this facility. And I'm sure I might get a question there as to what too many is, and there's no metrics or guidance I can provide there. Unfortunately, it needs to be a team kind of risk assessment of what is an acceptable number of crossing points. But if it was, every single driveway in a residential street that you wanted to provide this, and there was a high turnover of access to these points, it's not a facility I'd be looking at recommending, just because this right turning risk is pretty difficult to manage. There's only so much you can do. You could lower speeds, you could look at raising the pavement at the crossing point to make sure that if a vehicle crossing there were to collide with a cyclist, at least it would be at a lower speed. But yeah, there's generally, if you were looking at high numbers of these crossover points, you'd be looking at the one-way path option instead. I'm going to hop into some different separator types, but perhaps before I do, I'll check in with Ken to see how we're looking in the comments.
Yeah, a few comments have come up. So in a previous slide, there was a typical one-way traffic flow road the cyclist facility is two-way, so that sparked some interest from people, and also on that, some concerns about if there's parking really blocking those sight lines to bikes coming in both directions really there. So a couple of comments to think about. Could you just have the area between the road and the shared path wide enough for one car to stop?
Yes, so that's kind of what was illustrated in this point here. There is a little bit of a gap in between the general live traffic lane and the bidirectional facility. And that's certainly one approach to at least you're basically getting the right turning vehicle to pick a gap between traffic, stop, give way, pick a gap in cyclist traffic as well. It's not 100% illustrated in that example, but if you've got a wide enough carriageway, that's one way to deal with it.
Yeah, a little thing I like to also do in that cropping area is to use bluestones or something very like to slow that movement through there to really, make sure that they slow down just before that conflict point. Another point about shared crossing, when it crosses over a road and the signage of that, and that's quite an interesting topic. At the moment, it seems to be that you create the shared crossing into a road as such, and so you mark then the approaching road to that with a give way sign, like you would when you're approaching another road that has priority. And then you add the supplementary warning plates of the pedestrians and cyclists. And Wade makes a really good point. I mean, that's very counter to traditional sort of traffic engineering fundamentals of signs and lines, where you don't like to mix regulatory and warning signs together. But at the moment, that's the guidance that is being provided in a number of jurisdictions that are doing this. Queensland, Victoria, Tasmania follows that same one. I'm not exactly sure what New South Wales would do in those specific circumstances, but it may be an opportunity for a new regulatory sign to be developed.
Watch this space, yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
So I'll hop into separators now, and as mentioned, this is the type of protected bicycle lane that people generally imagine the Copenhagen lane. So these wide islands here, sometimes you can have precast islands as well, or bolt down islands, so you can install them quite readily and quite cheaply, which is quite a good way to do it. We've got lots of pop-up bike lanes in Melbourne that are dotted around at the moment, and they are being trials across the network, and they do use a lot of bolt down options, and they use rubber curbing and the like. And the idea is that, if there is significant community backlash, or the bicycle lanes are not working as they had hoped, they can just unbolt them and then bring it back to existing conditions. However, I think it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, because I think that they've done this as a political way of just getting it in there as a trial, and then maybe in a month's or a year's time we'll get to see some fully fledged permanent products out there instead. But it's just an interesting way of doing things. So this physical separation, I just wanted to highlight here curbing arrangements, because it's not always discussed and perhaps overlooked within this space. But if people are looking to implement this type of protected facility, there's a couple of different curbing options you can look at. One being your barrier curb. Now, the barrier curb has a less forgiving outcome, as you can imagine, for a cyclist, because it's got the sheer vertical face. In other words, if a cyclist were to collide with the barrier curb, their ability to stay on their bike is pretty limited. They're most likely going to fall off. So it's generally not recommended on the cycling side of things. However, for the parked lane, it is recommended. And the reason for that is because you don't want parked vehicles to mount this area at all. You don't want vehicles to, get any closer than they need to. They want to stay within that parked lane. So we like to see the barrier curb on this side. And For those that are not familiar with curb profiles, the barrier curb, the vertical face, and the other type of curb is in this middle photograph here, which I've got a semi-mountable curb. So that's the ramped type of curb. That's generally best placed on the cyclist side of things because that has much more forgiving. If you were to ride into the ramped curb, more likely to stay on your bike and just having to weave back on, and that's going to provide a better outcome. However, don't want to be installing those on the parked lane side. So this third example gets both the ticks. It's got the ramped on one side and it's got the barrier curb on the other side of the parking lane. And that's generally what we'd recommend if you are looking at the detailed design of these islands. Another thing to consider with your protected bicycle lanes, if you are providing these physical separations, it's really, really imperative to consider if there are any DDA requirements within this area. So if there's existing disability bays, ensuring that you're maintaining access to them, because you could imagine if this was continued throughout this section here, your ability for someone in a wheelchair to be able to access those spots, you've just blocked it off. So I know it sounds a little bit obvious now that you've seen this, but it is perhaps something that's not always considered as part of design. So ensuring that there are breaks where you are providing for disability bays and you've got a clear crossing point and a curb ramp for people with wheelchairs to access the adjacent footpath. So you're not just sticking them in the middle of the bicycle lane and hoping, okay, well, that's where the curb ramp is, that's where they can access it. You want to make that as quick and as accessible as possible for those that are hopping into their vehicles there. I've got an example of what not to do, essentially. Here is a protected bicycle lane, which is running here, general traffic, and this is a bus stop over here. And you can see they have installed a tiny little zebra crossing, which is, I've got nothing against. I think that's a good outcome to designate or formalise a crossing point for pedestrians to access the bus stop. I'll just zoom in on this a little bit. There's no actual curb ramps for the pedestrians though. So in other words, a pedestrian has to walk along the footpath, hop down onto the pavement, walk across, hop back up. Creates tripping hazards. It's not accessible for those people in wheelchairs or those that are, have some type of physical disability. So although this in theory looks okay, it hasn't been executed quite correctly. And this is still currently out there. This isn't just a mistake that was remedied, in the next week or something like that. That's just a real design flaw, in my opinion. So with some other separators, we had a look at these before, but these narrow type of separators, once again, you still see the gaps in these physical protections. Clearly it enables the drainage to get through and into the pit, which saves you constructing more drainage pits and more drainage lines. So using what's already there, this is a good way to do it. This also looks like a precast bolt down solution, which also makes things a little bit cheaper. Most appropriate, as I mentioned, where you have not got a parking lane adjacent here. These are both live traffic lanes. So if this were a parked vehicle, their vehicle passenger door would still be able to open and potentially interrupt the cyclist traffic there. So that wouldn't be a good example, but because this is live traffic lanes, this narrower facility is something that you could consider. Ken, we've got another question.
Just a couple of things ticking away in the background. Also, it brings back Wade's comment about the meter matters. I find that it's a bit odd in my mind. I think that's a pretty great facility, and the meter matter rule intention was to provide that space where there is no physical separation in my mind, but maybe just something for us to keep thinking about. A couple of comments around different facilities in the semi-mountable side of the thing, as you'd mentioned there. Some questions about, are we going to see some pop-up bike lane examples? I don't think we've got too many in this presentation, do we?
I think I've got one photo in there, but I can include some in the next presentation if you want to have a look. Yep.
Yeah, we could send around, put some in Moodle, and we've got video footage and things of that as well. So what's the speed zone was a question there. What sort of speed zones are appropriate for these kind of facilities?
I do hop into a diagram later on in this presentation, which illustrates exactly where you'd be looking at these. But yeah, typically you'd be looking at 50, 60 kilometers per hour.
Yep. Okay.
Yep.
Great.
Okay, I'll keep going. Got some more curb separators. Here's another one that's used to, I suppose, provide a little streetscape beauty and amenity to particular environments using curb planters to provide that level of separation between cyclists here and general traffic. It's got its benefits. I'm not against greenery. I love gardening. I love plants. No problem there. However, I would just stress this is how it looks perhaps once it's just been planted. If you look maybe 10 months down the track or a year later, would it look like this? Would it be overgrown? Would it be full of rubbish? And is all the leaf litter falling into the cycle lane instead and creating this, hazard for cyclists now to cycle around, which is generally the case that I see when cycling through these areas. So I'm not trying to say don't do the planter boxes as a curb treatment. I think they certainly have their place, but perhaps just be considering what type of plants you're putting in there. Things that, that they have a low profile and aren't going to be dropping leaves all over the path as well. Another thing to consider is if this is at a certain height, you may have to be, and depending on the width of this facility, it could be a hazard for pedal striking. So yeah, colliding your pedal with the edge of the planter box would not be a great outcome. So as long as there's sufficient width and the planter boxes are very conspicuous and easy to see, that's one way of mitigating that risk. I've got a question here for the group. This type of facility here, what do you reckon the name of this product is? So if anyone wants to pop down in the chat what they think, or what would you call this product? And a slight hint, the product name does reflect what the product looks like. So hopefully that helps out some people when they're thinking about this. But
loving what's coming in already here. A couple of people I think know it and they've got it correct. And Sam was the first in on that with armadillo. But I do like bumblebee. I reckon that's a good answer. It does kind of look like a bumblebee, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
Shell barriers, the bumblebee separator. That's great. Lots of people who like the bee, but it is an armadillo, am I correct, Max?
Yes, correct. And let's give out a prize to the first person with armadillo.
And the first
first person with the armadillo. Let's go for that.
And the first person with the bee.
Yes.
I like bee.
I like bee as well. And I think bee is pretty good. I also had a pangolin last time I presented this, which I thought was another excellent response. It does look like a pangolin. Pangolin, I don't really know how to say that. I've only ever seen it at the zoo. But it's a fun little product called the armadillo. It's actually used in Fremantle in Western Australia. They've got a trial there, although it's been there for nearly 10 years now. So it's more than a trial, I guess. But that's the little armadillo there, in case you have to refresh your memory and why it would be called that. But they are a good little product. They're recycled, which I'm a big fan of. So if you're looking at ways to promote sustainable products within your projects, this is recycled plastic and bolt down as well, so fairly easy to install. It's got the narrow kind of physical separation, similar to what the curb that I showed before. And because it's naturally got the gaps in between it, you don't need to worry about the drainage because it's already got that kind of built into it. You're not going to be putting one against the other. There's a project that we've worked on recently in Geelong, which is currently out for tender, where they are proposing to install these. So we're going to get our first armadillos in Victoria, which is pretty exciting. But yeah, that's just another product that's out there and that's been tried and tested. They are used quite abundantly in the US. So there's certainly other jurisdictions out there that can provide some more information on these products, but we're just starting to get them in Australia. Ken, I can see you smiling away. Is there?
Yeah, don't worry about it. No, Max. We're just talking about armadillos in jumpers and
Good.
which footy team they go for and things like that. Carry on.
Okay, let's talk about other types of separators as well. Here's an example of a pop-up facility. This one's in Richmond in Victoria. And we've got these flexible bollards. They've been installed at this angle to, I suppose, create a little bit of, visual cue to drivers to, this is your driver's lane. And you could also install them theoretically just, at the same longitudinal direction as the traffic lane and just go all the way across, but they opted for a angled approach. Probably don't have to install as many this fashion as well. So you might save a couple bucks doing it this way, but that's just another option. I like these flexible bollards because if they are struck by a cyclist, they jump straight back up. It's not going to be a fixed hazard, like another type of bollard, I guess. So it's not going to really impact on the cyclist if they were to collide with it. And also, because of these temporary nature of them, they are quite easy to install and get them out and replace them as well for maintenance crews and the like. So they generally have a lower cost associated with them as opposed to other treatments that I've shown. Similar type of example. This is another pop-up bicycle example, bike lane. So this used to be a traffic lane along here. Cyclists, they got to claim the lane, which during the pandemic, during the lockdowns in Victoria, we managed to get a little bit of political coercion, and we got to say, we don't need 3 traffic lanes in both directions along this road. Let's just bring it down to 2. We'll give one to the cyclists. Really great outcome for cyclists because I didn't actually include the source link for this one here, but this is, you can see the bridge here. It crosses over the river here, and cyclists used to have to join this very, very narrow footpath, essentially, mixed with pedestrians in both directions, and then join back onto the carriageway, which was a really, really poor outcome. So what they've got now, much better facility. It's about 2.5 meters wide, maybe 3 meters wide. And you've got this bolt down treatment once again with little flexible bollards once again to indicate that separation. And I will just note for this pop-up facility, they've kept the treatment very, very consistent along the route. So in other words, it's consistent messaging for drivers driving along there. This is the bicycle lane. They don't change the infrastructure. So they don't go from this to an armadillo to a Copenhagen lane. They keep it all like this. So it communicates that to drivers within the area that's exactly where the bicycles are, and that's what's used there to protect them.
Max, just a few comments coming in, some discussion around some people are not a fan of the armadillo, poor little armadillo, just in terms of the dangers to the cyclist if they're avoiding anything, and then just being that abrupt possibility to fall off. A bit more support for this sort of treatment in that sense, and a few people pointing out where these sorts of things have been used in Wollongong and a few other places, and people talking about the use of sort of armadillos and other raised separator facilities through traffic signals and the like, which I think we talk about next session. So we'll just move that one over. I think a little bit of questioning around which is easier for maintenance and debris build up and the like, and the armadillos work pretty well in that sense, but sounds like WA has stopped using those armadillos for the reason of the concern about hitting and falling off.
Yeah, I think I would tend to agree that if I were looking at something like this type of facility or the armadillos, I like that there's a vertical member, the paddle, that kind of sticks out and raises above the ground. It's a little bit easier if you were driving to be able to spot that rather than a tiny little armadillo that's just a couple hundred mil off the ground level. So I typically prefer this flexible bollard approach. I think it's a little bit easier to see as a driver.
Yep. Great, thanks.
Last separator I've got here for you. These flexible bollards are just single items, so they don't have that baseboard along them. This is an interesting type of facility in that this is actually parking in non-peak periods, and when it is peak hour, then it opens up to general through traffic. So because it is parking, you would like to see a much wider facility, once again, to account for that dooring risk for the passenger side. However, yeah, they've kind of acknowledged that, well, it's not parking for all day, so maybe we can get away with a narrower facility there, but I'm not sure that's a really fantastic outcome. This particular example, you've got a really, really wide footpath and you've got a park here. Potential to just bring cyclists and create a shared path instead, I think would be a good outcome, but this is what's out there. But yeah, I just wanted to demonstrate this is a different type of separator that you could use, and these are just dotted along, and I can confirm they are struck very, very regularly, both by live traffic lanes driving through and accidentally clipping it, or the parked vehicle here and then swinging open their door and hitting it as well. So not a great outcome. They're probably not quite as visible as other treatments, but something else you could consider if you were looking at providing these type of facilities. I've got a moment here. Oh, yep.
Eagle-eyed Gary down there in Launceston has spotted a few irregularities with the colour of reflectors on this one and the one before it, I think. So it makes a sort of few good points in there. So something to think about. So I think prize there for Gary on the eagle eye spotting inconsistency. So yeah, using white there, which probably should be red, and this one probably should be red as well, being the left for a driver. Does that make sense?
Well done. Very good pickup. Yep.
And so Jesse's made a good point here about the use of audio tactile edge line in urban environments, and Jesse's New South Wales based, and I know they're probably the most conservative in their use of audio tactile in terms of noise. Us Victorians tend to just go berserk and roll it out, and then on the odd occasion somebody complains, we'll go and scrape it back out. But any comments on the use of audio tactile as a separator in urban facilities?
I would tend to agree. We in Victoria just tend to chuck the stuff down there and hope for the best and hope that there's no real complaints. In rural areas, I know that they're starting to provide a 300-metre buffer away from properties, because they already acknowledge that that's exactly what rural areas will complain about. So in urban areas, though, because the speeds aren't as high and generally the risk of running off road or fatigue and drifting off probably isn't as high, you could argue that maybe this feature isn't as required. So I just drew an arrow there for those that are not familiar with the audio tactile. So it's just little raised bumps on the line marking there. So if you were to veer out of your lane, it provides a little haptic kind of noise and you feel it in your hands that you're leaving the traffic lane. I will just add, though, I've seen plenty of bicycle lanes where they have the audio tactile on the cycle lane sides of things, which I do not consider a good use of audio tactile. It wouldn't do anything but annoy cyclists, and it certainly, if an errand vehicle has gone all the way over to this side of the facility and is basically already in the bicycle lane, I don't think audio tactile is going to stop them. So something else to think about. All good, Ken?
Just a bit more on audio tactile. I mean, the common rules are around the 200 metres radius to any residence. As I say, I treat that as a guideline pretty much, because I think there's a bit of test to that. But nonetheless, it's something to be aware of and to think about. And yeah, a few other bits and pieces. But I think keep going, Max, because you've got plenty to cover.
I do. I was going to have another moment here for participants to get involved, and it's my favourite time of day asking, well, what's wrong with this photo? You can see That's Ken, looking very, very confused, trying to work out what's going on there. I'll get rid of Ken. Sorry, it's just in the way there. But if anyone wants to pop in the chat, what do you reckon? What's wrong with this photo? What's going on here? Why would I be putting this in the presentation? I'll just have a sip of water. You let me know if anything comes in, Ken.
Yeah, they're starting to come in now. So we've got car doors. The bike lane colour is very faded, non-existent. Doors, dooring method, no separation. Doors. Those pedestrians are a bit lost. Somebody popped in there. Dooring, pedestrians on the path, very little separation between the cars and the doors. Collision ahead. So lots of good comments there, Max.
That's good. Dooring is certainly the biggest hazard there, and I completely agree with all those doors. That's good to hear. But the one in particular I had focused on for this particular slide was the skateboarder and scooter. Difficult to see there if you had your magnifying glass out or your binoculars handy. They're using the bike lane there. Interesting little snap that we got there, but yeah, makes it difficult for cyclists to get around. Have to use the live traffic lane. Sorry, Ken.
There's quite a few people just commenting on the allocation of road space there for different road users. Big wide lane. Then you've got a hatched area over the far right. Yet the cyclists and in this case the skateboarders and everybody are pushed right up against the cars, which I think is a really valid thing to question around road space allocation at that higher level.
Right. So, but dooring is certainly what I wanted to focus on there. A door can swing about 1.2 meters from a vehicle. So when you are providing a bicycle lane that is 1.5 meters wide, you're basically saying there's 300 mil for a cyclist to avoid it, but really that's not going to avoid it anyway. They would have to go into the traffic lane, as you can see this person here. So that's why we consider the protected bicycle lanes as really the best practice, because you're completely eliminating that risk of the dooring, and you're getting general cyclist traffic away from general vehicle traffic. Ken, I believe you may have a bit of experience within this space of the dooring.
Oh, yeah. Yes. No, I haven't actually physically been doored. Avoided it many times, as many other riders have, but just happened to be having somebody do 360-degree filming right in front of me the other day when I nearly got done. So I'll upload that to the Moodle just so you can see my quick evasive action.
Well, that's exactly right. It relied on the cyclist to be paying, a lot of attention and to be able to engage in that emergency maneuver rather than, perhaps from the get-go, let's get the design right, and then we don't have to be putting that onus on the cyclists to be 100% hyper compliance at all times. But luckily, Ken's just a Superman and he swerved right around, no problem.
All right.
Here's an interesting little figure. Interesting in the sense that I'm not sure why it was ever commissioned, but this just illustrates where the common dooring accidents occur, what side of the vehicle. 75% on the driver's side, 25% on the passenger side. Makes a lot of sense. The driver's side is, a driver always has to be in the vehicle, and also the bicycle lane is generally always opposite the driver's side. So it certainly makes sense for a lot of the collisions to be occurring there, and obviously the majority being on the driver door itself. I've got this other little graph here, which is a useful reference point, which basically just suggests different types of treatments that may be appropriate along this axis, depending on what type of road use or strategically that corridor functions. I'm just going to focus on the main items, which is stating if it's a bicycle priority route, it's saying that it is a red, which means it's unlikely to be appropriate to relocate cyclists. Makes sense. But it's another interesting thing is saying that one-way protected lanes, two-way protected lanes, and off-road paths it's always considered appropriate to investigate that as an option, regardless of what type of traffic route we have. So that's something to consider. Perhaps that's something we should be prioritising, because those are always considered appropriate. Relocation of parking may be appropriate on collector roads and local roads. However, it depends circumstance to circumstance. Just something to consider. I've got this example here of another big dooring risk here. This is a popular high street with lots of cafes and commercial businesses and the like. Low or high turnover of parking, and the bicycle lane. It's a little bit difficult to see here, but you can see there's just like a little sliver of a green painted wedge. So it's not painted the entire bicycle lane. It is just that little part on the right. And that was intentional. These were called anti-dooring bike lanes. It was on Glenferrie Road, for those that are interested. Oh yeah, I've included it there. And the intent of this is to get cyclists to be cycling within this area here rather than in the middle of the bicycle lane. And that's to hopefully reduce the risk of a dooring incident occurring, because if that door opens, if you were cycling in the middle, you'd get collected. If you were cycling here, hopefully you've got a better chance of swerving around. I don't see this as being the answer to the dooring issue. This was used as a trial in 2015 and it's still out there. So obviously they were happy with what they saw. Just a few stats from the study. 75% of cyclists surveyed within this particular trial felt more comfortable after the installation of the anti-dooring lane. So that's a pretty significant statistic, really. So beforehand, there was just this bicycle lane, basically. Then they chucked down this little green strip, and 75% of cyclists felt more comfortable with that little green strip, which is quite remarkable. And it also had the effect of getting general traffic to stay within their traffic lane. So believe it or not, this little green strip had an effect on getting vehicles' traffic movements to be away from the bicycle lane, which is a positive. So you can certainly take it or leave it, this particular trial. But as I said, I would not see this as the answer for removing the risk of dooring, because it still exists. And don't get me wrong, these high street environments are difficult to cater for, but if we can provide protected facilities, let's get the cyclists over here, let's get the parked vehicles over here with a nice separated facility. That's a much better outcome. Ken.
Okay, a few different things popping up. So some discussion there about the one advantage of bidirectional bike lanes. If you have the riders hitting the doors from that other direction, it's a much more friendly hit. That's a good point. A few of the jokes about the repainting. The other one here though that I wanted to do was no, carry on. I'll deal with these other ones behind the scenes.
I thought you froze for a second. I was like, oh boy, it's all good. So we've got some painted interventions as well that we can use here for cycling facilities. Double chevron line marking. So chevron, for those that are not familiar, is this type of pavement marking here. This is our cyclist lane here and our parking lane on the curbside there. So the benefit of this is door swings open. You've got a little bit of a buffer there, provides buffer, which is good for your cyclists. And also there's a buffer in between the live traffic lanes. So if they were to slightly get out of their traffic lane, there's a little bit of space before they're into the bicycle lane. So there is benefit there. Perhaps this left-hand side illustration reflects that a little bit better. Cyclist has got a bit more space between that door, and there's a little bit more room there between the live traffic lane. Here's an example of some typical widths if you're interested in providing this type of facility. Chevron separators, generally 600 mil. I'm not sure I've seen 1.2 meters either side. And bike lane widths, I would say 1.5. I'm not sure you'd get a 4 meter width in any type of carriageway. If you were getting that type of carriageway width, I wouldn't be looking at providing this facility. Let's do a physical separation, protected bicycle lanes. If you've got plenty of carriageway to play with, don't be building this. This is not quite as good as completely protecting the cyclists. Another example here is single chevron, and you can either put this adjacent the parking lane or adjacent the traffic lane. So you can put it there or there. I'll just focus on this one to get started with. So this is adjacent the parking lane. This obviously takes into account your dooring risk, like so, and gives you a bit more of a buffer. However, you don't have that buffer now between the general traffic and your bicycle lane. So when would you be likely to include it on this side rather than the traffic lane side? If this parking lane was high turnover, so if it was a high street, for instance, or, time limited parking, in other words, you're going to get doors opening more frequently, that's when your risk would generally be to provide for the dooring risk. That's what you should be considering to protecting, which means putting the chevron on that side. Once again, some just guidance of what those dimensions look like. I won't jump into them at the moment, just looking at the time. Here's your other type of chevron treatment provided on the traffic lane side. So this one is right up against, the cycle lane is right up against the parking lane. And this is the opposite when you would provide this. If this was long-term parking, so perhaps this is residential streets where you would expect that vehicle to sit there for longer periods of the day, that's when you may be more inclined to be worried about live traffic lanes and providing the buffer on that side. I tend to always go for the chevron on this side, the parking lane. Just as a cyclist, I'm always more concerned about a dooring opening right in front of me than general traffic from behind me colliding with me. The reason for that is generally, if this is a straight alignment, a vehicle behind me should be able to spot me. They should be able to see me, and that's, I'm within their line of sight. However, someone in their car, I could be within their blind spot, and they may have no idea. They may not think to even check for a cyclist. And I generally think that that's a higher risk for me, anecdotally, than live traffic from behind me. However, depends on exactly what type of movements you got there and the type of parking arrangement. Once again, just some figures there if you want to be looking at implementing this type of treatment. I'll hop into exclusive bike lanes.
Just some more comments about sort of the speed environments where these are appropriate, different treatments are appropriate. A lot of people discussing, could we just swap them, put the bike curbside, push that all out, which I think are really valid points, and but they do need a little bit more treatment to sort of stop the cars still parking curbside, so those sorts of things. But it's it's all good stuff. Good discussion. Good
to hear. It's all everyone's got similar ideas there.
Yeah, and also the fact that if you have your parking on that side, the entry and exit of the parking causes conflict with the cyclists as well.
That's right. Yep. Exclusive bike lanes, these are fairly common on arterial roads, so relatively high, 60, 70, 80 kilometres per hour speed limits. Not a big fan of these generally because there's no level of protection other than a single white line to delineate the space for a cyclist on the edge of the traffic lane. I would suggest if you are providing these types of facilities and you've already saying this is exclusively for cyclists, could we not consider implementing some type of physical flexible bollard or the like to delineate it even clearer, but also providing that visual cue to general traffic that don't enter this space because it's for cyclists. I think if we get as a step forward on our network, if we look at implementing these types of treatments, it will just communicate that we're better protecting for cyclists.
Sorry, Max, just on that.
Okay.
There's also a little bit of discussion, some good points here about the dooring not having, it does exist where there's been fatals and serious injuries, but the far more dominant crash type is vehicle in the lane hitting cyclists. So just adding that into the mix of the thinking as well. And again, more discussion about how we then redesign some of these sorts of areas, taking into account the meter matter rules and how it should be sort of reconfigured in an ideal scenario where we can design a way and provide full space there for cyclists to freely ride. So lots of things to think about.
Definitely, yes. Good to hear the meter matter is all over this conversation as well. It's excellent to hear. Only recently legislated in Victoria, the last state to do it, but we finally got there, which is good. Great work from AGF. Wide curbside bike lanes. Not a fan of these. These ones are just little dots on the pavement, roughly every 200 metres or so to say, cyclists might be here, but in between those spaces, it's just like a wide a wide traffic lane. And when you get wide traffic lanes, you get faster operating speeds. So this is basically not a good example of cycling infrastructure and something that I would not really consider implementing at all, really. I can't really consider this as being a preferential treatment. If you are trying to improve cycling connectivity, if this is identified as an important route for cyclists, then we shouldn't be providing this, really subpar infrastructure, because it's just lines on the road and it's going to increase operating speeds for general traffic, and it's not going to really improve the level of safety for cyclists. So not going to spend too much time on this one. For mixing traffic, so this is where we get more into the speeds and what kind of operating speeds we'd like to see when we are providing for different cycling infrastructure. This example here, we've got the cyclist right up against the dooring zone, and also, for general traffic passing within this area, it's not quite wide enough to be able to pass the cyclist as well. So the cyclist kind of has to go in between parked vehicles and then let a vehicle behind them overtake them. So this is not a really good example because you've got this median physical infrastructure here that blocks that overtaking movement. So what you can get is lots and lots of vehicles trying to squeeze past the cyclists, getting really, really close to these fixed hazards in the median island here, and also getting really, really close to the cyclist. The other real significant risk here is if a door were to open and a cyclist were to collide with that, they were to fall onto the pavement there, a general traffic to be able to swerve and miss or emergency brake and try and get out of the way of the cyclist that's just fallen over. There's basically nowhere to go. They can't go into the parked lane, they can't go into the central reserve. So just something else to consider when you're mixing traffic, if there's those follow-up crashes. So not necessarily just the dooring incident, but what could follow on after that, which can be very, very significant. This was the diagram I alluded to earlier. So when different speeds may warrant different types of cycling treatments. So generally less than 40 kilometers per hour, lane sharing. And I'm just going to highlight that the 40 kilometers per hour is operating speed. So it's not just about putting a 40 kilometer speed sign there and saying, okay, cyclists can now ride lane share there. It would be about ensuring that there's appropriate local area traffic management treatments and traffic calming, basically. So you're getting operating speeds down to 40 kilometers per hour or below. For those that have done the safe system training or are familiar with the safe system philosophy, they would be aware that for a vehicle collision with a cyclist, what's often referred to as the safe system speed is 30 kilometers per hour. So in other words, anything less than or at 30 kilometers per hour or less, there is a 10% likelihood that that will result in a cyclist fatality. Once you go above the 30%, the risk of that fatality rises exponentially. It's the curve kind of that looks like this. And where you're at 30 kilometers per hour, it's about this point here. And that's at 10%. But once you start going past the speeds than that, it just rises exponentially, so right above and beyond. So generally, we want to keep traffic speeds at this 30 kilometer per hour speed. Okay.
I was just going to say that yeah, that diagram, the original diagram was out of the Netherlands, and it actually had the cutoff at 30 kilometers an hour. And somehow, in its translation across, when the Victorian government published it, it jumped up to 40 kilometers an hour. So I think that's quite interesting. Anyway, a couple of other things that have popped up here. That example one slide back with the bike in the middle, or that facility there. Talk about sort of if it's genuine mixed traffic, the bike should be able to be riding in the middle of the road there, which I ride that one a bit as well. I think, wouldn't be comfortable claiming the lane in that scenario. So it's a bit of an awkward one. Also talking about the Austroads requirements on cycle lanes getting wider and wider over the years. And what's the view if a compliant width cannot be provided?
That's a pretty good question, and I think that would really depend on projects by projects. You'd need to really conduct a risk assessment. It's difficult to provide a blanket response to that without looking at project deliverables and exactly the extent of the scope of works. But yeah, it's the same with anything. Regularly, we may not be able to meet design constraints or guidelines, and whether or not it's worth implementing that infrastructure or leave the risk as is, there's always that conversation that needs to be had.
There has been a little off topic here, Max. There has been quite a number of people asking if Wally has forgotten to get out of bed and join the presentations. I haven't seen any Wallies yet.
Well, I should have mentioned that at the start, shouldn't I? But no, Wally's not joining us today because we don't have a quiz at the end of today. We have an assignment instead. So no Wally's, rest assured. I haven't been making them microscopic or anything and hiding them in the bushes, but there's no Wally's today. Apologies for not making that clear at the start.
It's all right. It made everybody be very concentrated.
That was a good tactic, actually.
Okay, let's keep going.
So between this 40 and 60 kilometre per hour speed limit, we're looking at relocation of parking, separated bicycle lanes. So the protected bicycle lanes is basically what fits in here. Anything greater than that is where we're looking at off-road bicycle facilities. So well and truly away from the carriageway and certainly separated, physically separated. For those that are not familiar with this type of pavement marking, this is called a sharrow, which is the bicycle symbol and these arrows that's installed on the pavement itself. And this actually communicates to cyclists and to motorists that cyclists, you now claim the lane, you can now cycle in the middle of the traffic lane. So it's a little bit of hesitancy for perhaps beginner cyclists because it means that they now they don't have their own facility, they now need to ride in the traffic lane, but that's what this symbol means. And there are lots of good examples of where this is working. And in that photo that I showed of the mixed traffic, I think that would be a good example of where we could install these to get cyclists confident claiming the traffic lane and rather than riding right up against the dooring. So here we've got one, this is in Collingwood in Melbourne. We've got the sharrow here at the start of the local street. And I'm also just going to zoom in here because we've actually got a 30 area. So it's actually a 30 speed zone, which I'm a big fan of. You can also see in the distance here, there are some speed humps, there's local area traffic management treatments or traffic calming. So not only it's about providing the sign as mentioned, but providing the infrastructure. So vehicles actually, they're not going to be able to reach 40, 50, 60 kilometers per hour in this stretch. They're going to have lower operating speeds. Another example of the 30, this one is in regional Victoria. This is in Warrnambool. Once again, 30, once again, the sharrows. So cyclists are riding in the middle of the traffic lane, just like a car would, and giving them opportunity to not be right up against the parking lane, particularly in this instance where you've got angled parking. Some other local area traffic management treatments. This example is from Adelaide, and I just wanted to bring this one up. This is like a one-way slow point, so only one vehicle in one traffic stream can travel at a time. So a vehicle would have to going this way, a vehicle in the other direction would have to prop and wait. But the reason I like this type of treatment is because cyclists, they get to travel straight through here and they don't need to worry about slowing down because there's enough of a gap there that they don't need to worry about the speed hump. So rather than bringing the speed hump all the way across, there's these little cutouts. So cyclists get to have a more continuous journey and probably be traveling through this street faster than general traffic, which is also pretty cool. I also included a little ABC article in there because this particular treatment was not received fondly by a particular local who decided to graffiti all the signs in Adelaide. An elderly lady actually decided to get out the spray paint. So if you wanted to read that article, you can have a click on that. Just on some other local area traffic management, this one's a little bit difficult to see, but this is a bicycle lane here that runs through, and for the general traffic, the road closes like this. So they have to travel around. I'll just hop to an aerial view, which should make things a little bit clearer. I think I've got arrows here. So I've got this orange arrow here indicates how a motorist would travel through this particular treatment. So it's like a partial road closure, and cyclists get to travel straight on through. And there are benefits and disbenefits to this. The benefit is that you're going to discourage, through traffic basically, because why would you want to have to travel this circuitous route if you're just trying to get through the area? It's going to instead get general motorists on arterials, which are nearby and in parallel. The disbenefit is you've introduced two conflict points that weren't previously there. So previously a motorist could just travel straight on through, but instead you've got now two clear paths where a motorist and a cyclist could potentially collide. And it's also a little bit unclear as to who would give way to who. So grain of salt with this type of treatment. I've got another example, which is a better example of this. So here we've got the cyclists traveling straight through as before, but the general traffic, they are actually redirected along the right-hand side like this. So I'll go back onto my aerial view here, which should make things a little bit clearer. Here, I'll just draw the cyclist traveling through here, straight through this closed off street, whereas general traffic do not have access through here. So this is a full closure for them. They have to go back, do a U-turn, and then travel away. In other words, you're providing this network that is not permeable for general traffic. It's basically only going to accommodate that local network and that local residences along there. And because this is it used to be a north-south route into Melbourne CBD, this took a lot of the traffic off this local street and onto the arterials, which is what you want. And providing these treatments just provides a greater level of safety for cyclists here, because cyclists have a nice smooth run through here and don't need to worry about the cars kind of, chock-a-block there in peak hours and lots of congestion and the like. So providing these treatments is also a really good way to implement local area traffic management. Going to close on this slide here. This is another example of what not to do if you're going to be bringing cyclists up onto a shared facility, or don't be putting a barrier there in the place, because that's not going to make things too easy. I also just wanted to share this fellow here. This is a regular penny farthing user who rides along a busy arterial road. There's parked vehicles on this lane here. There's trams, really, really high volumes of general traffic, and buses along there as well. But he just gets on his penny farthing and gets on with it. It's near our office, so we get to see him up and down fairly often, and he's just a real icon of the area. So just wanted to maybe indicate that cyclists are not always the general two-wheel, although that is two wheels, but two regular wheels and a handlebar, and he's raised well and truly up above typical cyclist height. Yeah. Anyway, Ken, I might pass on to you.
Oh yeah, less chance of that dynamic visual obstruction crash when you're up that high.
That's right.
There was a question that came in about bicycle boulevards, Max, and did you cover them at any point in the because there's that new one being proposed?
Is it in Perth, that one?
Oh, there's the Western Australian ones, but no, the Napier Street is going to get that bicycle.
Oh, Napier Street. Yes. No, I haven't included in this presentation. I had so much content to get through as is, but yes, I can touch on that perhaps early next module just to get everyone across what that means.
Okay. I better take over the slides here, Max, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
Because I need to briefly show people what they have to do now. So in Moodle, hopefully you're seeing on my screen there, Moodle. And you will have done your 360-degree on and had a look at that, done your quiz from module 1 and the recording. There you go. There's an example where the recording. You've got another 360-degree to look at. Same thing. Hope your goggles are working or you've given that a crack. Pop it into the chat whether you actually got it to work and you found it quite the experience, or whether you just resorted to the desktop version, which is still pretty good. Then you're going to do module 2 assignment. So no quiz this week. So you're going to jump into module 2 assignment. You've got 2 documents here. You've got a Word document and you've got a PDF. The PDF is a design and it's a design for York Street, a very conceptual design just for training purposes. Don't go out and do community consultation with this one. I think Gary will talk to you sternly if you do that, and others from Launceston. No, it's just a concept for you to have a look at, a few ideas, and then in the Word document, which is what you're going to fill your information out about, you'll see here that you just fill out. You pop your name in there. You have a look on Street View at the existing conditions. How does the existing environment cater for cyclists? So just to put a few comments in there, a bit of a few thoughts, and then have a look at the design. Say, how does that improve things? Is it better, or are there still issues? And then what would you change in the design to improve safety for cyclists? So just 3 simple questions, few dot points, few words in there, Max, and then you finish that off, save it, and you go into here and you upload it into Moodle. You've got, when's it due? Friday the 17th. So you're going to get onto it fairly quickly, but it should only take you 5 minutes, really. Bit of a look at the design, 10 minutes maybe. So try and knock it off. And if you absolutely can't meet that deadline, just let us know and we'll probably grant you an extension.
I'd recommend getting stuck into it early, though, just while all this content is fresh in your head, and the slides that we just went through would be a great reference. But yeah, it makes a lot of sense just to strike while the iron is hot, so to speak.
And unless there are any final questions or comments, Max, I think we can let people jump into that in the last 2 minutes and see if they can move things along. Have a look at the 360-degree footage, because again, at the start of the next session, Max is going to be asking you questions. Which did you like? What did you feel about that? Have a look through the 2 different options there. And one of them, you've already seen some pictures of the Wellington Street Collingwood facility. And I can't remember what the other one was, just around the corner, I think, down the road. So thank you very much, Max. Thanks, everybody. Wonderful session. Packed a lot into the hour and a half. And
yes.
Yeah, we'll see you.
Surprised I got it with 1 minute to spare. I'm pretty happy. There was a lot of content, but didn't get onto the bicycle boulevard. So we'll get to have a chat about that next Tuesday, actually. So everyone, enjoy your weekend. Stay safe. If you're in lockdown at the moment, yes, please look after yourself and your family and your friends. And hopefully we'll see you all next Tuesday ready to go.
Thanks, Max. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, guys.
Bye.